Today, we're exploring fake news. And this is a term that really has, at least in my mind, become quite popular just in recent years. But as you'll see today, there's a vast and long and important history that we're going to explore. But if you're wondering why does this relate to our health and wellness? Why is this important as we navigate our companies, as we go about our daily lives? Why is it important that we understand the history of fake news and begin to explore how we determine what is information that we can really digest and base our lives on, and what is information that can be potentially dangerous? I don't know. I just know that for me, I kind of want to be able to read something and feel a sense of, can I trust this? Can I take this information as we navigate COVID times? Should we be wearing face masks or should we not? Should we be concerned about our kids potentially going back to school or should we not? There is just so much information. And what I know is that for me, this person right here, that concern around disinformation sometimes just makes my head hurt. And when my head is hurting, it's really kind of challenging to just navigate my day-to-day living. It's an added element of anxiety and stress. And so that is why, for me, it maps back to our health. It maps back to our sense of well-being. Today, I'm so excited to be joined on the virtual couch by Victor Hernandez, who is the executive editor of Cascade Public Media, and Carolyn Neeson, who is the author of Reporting on Race in the Digital Era. I just spent this weekend reading this book and whoa, mind blown. We're gonna get into it. So grab your cup of coffee, get comfy, let the kids come in on this conversation too. I know that they're walking through the background, so just go on, grab them and have them tuck up with you on the couch, and let's delve into it. Carolyn Nielsen, where do we begin? I, was sitting, I was not able to get up in this book for, you can find it on Amazon right now. It is worth every penny, or penny still a thing? I don't know. It is worth every penny. Can you just introduce us to this idea of what is objectivity in journalism? Is that a thing? Just start us off.
Sure, it's my pleasure. Thank you so much for having me this morning, and thank you for the kind words about my book. When I wrote it, it was really meant to start a conversation, so I love that it's starting this conversation or playing a role in this conversation. That's really important to me. So I'm a former journalist, and now I'm a journalism professor at Western Washington University. And when I was coming up or being trained as a journalist as an undergrad and a master's student, we were taught that objectivity was a thing and it was a goal, that you could be objective. And I should also say that throughout my bachelor's and master's degrees, I never had a conversation about diversity in any classroom. I never did. I'm not that old. We never talked about it. It wasn't something that came up. We talked a lot about getting all sides of the story, but we didn't talk really about stakeholders. And so what that looked like in my journalism education was people who were for it, people who were against it, and the various reasons why. Not people's lived experience, not people's positionality, not people's standpoint. We didn't talk about this difference between people who are elites who have power to set policy versus people who are suffering from those policies. That was never part of our conversation. And so as an educator, that is always part of my conversation. Yes. And it's not something I was ever told so much as something I observed in working in a newsroom, where people didn't really put pressure on, editors didn't really put pressure on reporters to ensure that all stakeholders were represented or that various types of voices were in the conversation. It was more like a box you could check, right? Do we have the pro? Do we have the con? Do we have something else? Okay, good, it can go now. I will say, first of all, objectivity is not a thing. When we look back at our professional codes, the Society of Professional Journalists has had a code of ethics since the Second World War in some version. Right after that, and the first ones did talk about objectivity is something only the best reporters can achieve, right? But since the early 1990s, in the last revision, the Code of Ethics really says reporters have biases, and it's your ethical mission to examine your own biases and to keep them out of your reporting, which is another level of problem, because the conversation we're having now with current journalists is that your lived experience can and probably should be part of your reporting. And so we've really shifted through several different ethical paradigms just in the last couple of decades. And the one we're in now, where people are really conflicted and navigating whether your lived experience becomes part of your reporting, that's a really important conversation that's going on in journalism right now. But the short answer is no. Objectivity is not a thing. It's never been a thing. What you decide is news, who you decide to interview, the questions you decide to ask them, those are all very subjective choices. And they're kind of rooted in a newsroom culture that's overwhelmingly cis white men. And so that's the dominant perspective we get.
And so even, if we could just like bring that home for a second, it's important to name that even on this show, the topics that we choose, with the show's producers, Terea and Carlos, and the people that we invite to speak, and all of Lindsay's lived experience, it is going to be naturally skewed by sort of this idea that we want to get across, or the questions that I'm asking, they are based on my education, they are based on my lived experience. There's never going to be this ability to just really remove the interviewer, the producers, the guest away from just the information. That's
exactly right. That's perfectly parallel. And the question is now whether it's beneficial that people bring in their lived experience, or whether they should really try and shunt it away, and whether that's even possible. And I would argue that it's not, and that it's not a good idea. I would argue that as someone who teaches journalism, your lived experience should inform the questions you're asking.
Yeah. For everybody watching at home, I just heard Carolyn Nielsen say you should keep watching this show. So,
absolutely.
Victor, how is this playing out on your news floor every day?
Yeah, you bet. So I completely concur with Carolyn in that, reporters are biased because we are human beings. And, and to go a few steps further, algorithms, computer coding has proven to have bias as well in the distribution, the dissemination, the collection of news and information. Likewise, because these are systems that were programmed by human beings ultimately. And so that is something we can't get around. The word objectivity is about as complex as is the words fake news. There's a lot of different layers to it. We try and sort of go around the flippant use of the word objectivity and just really emphasize fairness in what we do and what we practice. Certainly the optics, the process in which we conduct ourselves has changed immensely in the last 15 to 20 years because of technology and because of greater access into people's lives, both the communities we seek to cover, but also as communities and other circles can look at the people behind the computers and cameras and notepads who are performing the journalism work. It used to be that we could compartmentalize our convictions and our personal beliefs, and as long as we adhered to the code of ethics that Carolyn refers to, that we wouldn't openly endorse a candidate, for example. We wouldn't freely discuss political views and opinions that affect a position or a policy, or again, a candidate, or a political figure. And that still is the case, but how we conduct ourselves with the internal beliefs and powerful convictions through these lived experiences is really fundamental, and there's no getting around that. There's no burying that. Who you choose to interview, the types of questions you ask, the types of questions you choose not to ask, what that follow-up looks like, what the framing and so forth. And so rather than sort of try and focus on a mythical goal of everyone who works within our newsroom will remain objective and that is in which how we will always proceed, it's really about putting priority focus on the core tenets of producing ethical journalism. And who you choose to align with in your personal views is one thing, and that is for you to sort of reconcile and sort of contend with, but it should not play a role in the types of stories we choose to go after and the questions we ask and so forth. And we need to keep that at the forefront. There is a concern, of course, around conflicts of interest and whether a journalist brings forward an agenda or a bent toward or against a topic that they are covering. But in addition to that, the parallel that's also critically important is any perceived conflict of interest. And that comes back to audience trust and community relationships and some of the things that newsrooms have fundamentally not been very good at over the years around being more transparent and being more revealing around process and how we conduct the work that we do and how we choose the stories in which get displayed in the newspaper, on television, on websites. What does that look like, and how do other parts of the community, particularly marginalized communities, have a seat at the table to get their stories told, to have their voices heard? And so this role of a gatekeeper within news media environment has been a troublesome one, a very challenging one, but through a lot of which is innovation and the ability to have better access to get into these reporting channels, that's at least played a role in allowing for these issues to really break through, which is a good thing. So it is a all the way around a very complex layered conversation, but it's one that's critically important for us to just continually revisit and make some adjustments around to what are we not thinking about? Where do we need to be more inclusive? What does proper representation look like?
Yeah. And we're going to get, stay tuned, everybody, because later we're going to get into some ideas from both Carolyn and Victor on how you can not arm oneself, but, sort of approach the news and the stories you're reading with a bit of a critical eye. And, you're really going to want to take notes on that. But before we do, Carolyn, can you speak about, in your book, I was reading about journalism 3.0, and it sounds like it's speaking to some of the innovations that we're seeing right now in media, in how we approach journalism. Can you share what journalism 3.0 is?
Sure, I'd be happy to. In my work, I really try and look at the broadening landscape of journalism, not just the New York Times and the Washington Post and, the venerated institutions of legacy news media, or what I call traditional news media. In those, editors sit around a table and decide what's news, and then reporters go out and report those stories, or reporters bring stories to the newsroom. Hey, I have this story idea. They run it by an editor. That's what happens.
So that's kind of imagining like the scenes in like Superman, where, they would all sit around and throw ideas, and then they'd go get me a picture on this.
That's exactly right. In journalism, we call it a budget meeting, and it happens usually twice a day, once in the morning and once in the afternoon. And people sit around a table in the morning and decide, what's the, and those, that changes all day long, right? In journalism, the premise there is that reporters and editors, or journalists, are deciding what's news, right? And that refers back to what Victor's talking about in terms of gatekeeping. What we have seen now is that gatekeeping has given way to a term we now call gate watching. And that acknowledges the power of social media to drive the news agenda. So in Journalism 3.0, we're talking about outfits like BuzzFeed, Vox-ish, not always, Vox can be a little political elite, but those news outlets are looking at social media, saying, hey, what does the audience really care about? And let's report on that. And it's a blend of, which cheese are you, quizzes, and really serious reporting, especially about racial issues. So Ta-Nehisi Coates, that author and activist who's amazing, has said that BuzzFeed is actually doing the best coverage of racial issues of any newspaper or news organization in the country. And people were sort of surprised to hear that. I think part of that is the value system of not deciding for the audience what's news, but letting the audience say what they're interested in and taking up those issues and then reporting them. The other thing that Journalism 3.0 does particularly is it values what scholars call the voices of the oppressed, right? So it values lived experience as an essential component of the coverage. You'll see those voices of people who are living oppression elevated in Journalism 3.0 coverage. You'll also see, it's also called like constructionist or feminist news values. You'll see people saying, here's how to be a better ally, or, you'll see news you can use in a way that helps marginalized communities in a way that you will not see in traditional legacy news media. So it's just very different. It's also really strongly appealing to a younger, more racially diverse audience of that 18 to 24-year-old coveted demographic that traditional news media has a very hard time reaching sometimes, who are using their phones to access news. And we're seeing this younger generation more engaged in public affairs news than any previous generation, which to me is fascinating. It's the number 3 reason, this was from a Pew Research study, it's the number 3 reason folks in the 18 to 24-year-old category are using their phones is to read public affairs news. And so BuzzFeed also seeks to be very mobile, meet the audience where they are. You don't go to BuzzFeed.com to read news, right? You more encounter it on your social media platform. So it's a different distribution model as well. And it's wildly popular.
Yeah. I mean, because you kind of just mentioned it, and I have to say, I spent hours, you put this one sentence in your book, and then I had to go spend hours studying so I could come back to that sentence and understand it. Thanks, Carolyn. Thanks. Can we talk about how a constructionist democracy model, first, I'm going to let you explain it. I'm still a student here, right? And then both of you, I've heard you speak about why that is important in terms of how we approach our media, how we approach information. So Carolyn, if you would like to, yes, go. Because
Sure.
I could try to say what I understood, but you're the professor.
That's all right. It pretty, so it's this big term, normative values and democratic theory, right? But it really maps onto what journalism does, which is who speaks, how they speak, and what's the goal of the speech, right? And so in constructionist feminist news values, who speaks are the people who are living the oppression. How they speak, and I study this in the context of racial issues, so how they speak is that racism is presumed to be a given rather than a question. Versus if you compare that to traditional or legacy news media, racism has often been portrayed as, well, it might be, it might not be, here's what one person thinks, here's this both-siderism. Some people say